Sketches of Young Gentlemen. By Charles Dickens. To the young ladies of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Also, the young ladies of the Principality of Wales. And likewise, the young ladies resident in the Isles of Guernsey, Jersey, Alderney, and Sark. The humble dedication of their devoted admirer. Should that your dedicator has perused, with feelings of virtuous indignation, a work purporting to be Sketches of Young Ladies, written by Quiz, illustrated by Phiz, and published in 1 volume, square 12mo. That after an attentive and vigilant perusal of the said work, your dedicator is humbly of opinion that so many libels, upon your honourable sex, were never contained in any previously published work in 12mo or any other mo. That in the title page and preface to the said work, your honourable sex are described and classified as animals, and although your dedicator is not at present prepared to deny that you are animals, still he humbly submits that it is not polite to call you so. That in the aforesaid preface, your honourable sex are also described as troglodytes, which, being a hard word, may, for aught your honourable sex or your dedicator can say to the contrary, be an injurious and disrespectful appellation. That the author of the said work applied himself to his task in malice prepense and with wickedness aforethought, a fact which, your dedicator contends, is sufficiently demonstrated, by his assuming the name of Quiz, which, your dedicator submits, denotes a foregone conclusion, and implies an intention of quizzing. That in the execution of his evil design, the said Quiz, or author of the said work, must have betrayed some trust or confidence reposed in him by some members of your honourable sex, otherwise he never could have acquired so much information relative to the manners and customs of your honourable sex in general. That actuated by these considerations, and further moved by various slanders and insinuations respecting your honourable sex contained in the said work, square 12mo, entitled Sketches of Young Ladies, your dedicator ventures to produce another work, square 12mo, entitled Sketches of Young Gentlemen, of which he now solicits your acceptance and approval. That as the young ladies are the best companions of the young gentlemen, so the young gentlemen should be the best companions of the young ladies, and extending the comparison from animals, to quote the disrespectful language of the said Quiz, to inanimate objects, your dedicator humbly suggests, that such of your honourable sex as purchased the bane should possess themselves of the antidote, and that those of your honourable sex who were not rash enough to take the first, should lose no time in swallowing the last, prevention being in all cases better than cure, as we are informed upon the authority, not only of general acknowledgement, but also of traditionary wisdom. That with reference to the said bane and antidote, your dedicator has no further remarks to make, than are comprised in the printed directions issued with Dr. Morrison's pills, namely, that whenever your honourable sex take 25 of number 1, you will be pleased to take 50 of number 2, without delay. And your dedicator shall ever pray, N.C. The Bashful Young Gentleman. We found ourselves seated at a small dinner party the other day, opposite a stranger of such singular appearance and manner, that he irresistibly attracted our attention. This was a fresh-coloured young gentleman, with as good a promise of light whisker as one might wish to see, and possessed of a very velvet-like, soft-looking countenance. We do not use the latter term invidiously, but merely to denote a pair of smooth, plump, highly coloured cheeks of capacious dimensions, and a mouth rather remarkable for the fresh hue of the lips than for any marked or striking expression it presented. His whole face was suffused with a crimson blush, and bore that downcast, timid, retiring look, which betokens a man ill at ease with himself. There was nothing in these symptoms to attract more than a passing remark, but our attention had been originally drawn to the bashful young gentleman, on his first appearance in the drawing-room above stairs, into which he was no sooner introduced, than making his way towards us who were standing in a window, and wholly neglecting several persons who warmly accosted him, he seized our hand with visible emotion, and pressed it with a convulsive grasp for a good couple of minutes, after which he dived in a nervous manner across the room, oversetting in his way a fine little girl of 6 years and a quarter old, and shrouding himself behind some hangings, was seen no more, until the eagle eye of the hostess detecting him in his concealment, on the announcement of dinner, he was requested to pair off with a lively single lady, of 2 or 3 and 30. This most flattering salutation from a perfect stranger, would have gratified us not a little as a token of his having held us in high respect, and for that reason been desirous of our acquaintance, if we had not suspected from the first, that the young gentleman, in making a desperate effort to get through the ceremony of introduction, had, in the bewilderment of his ideas, shaken hands with us at random. This impression was fully confirmed by the subsequent behaviour of the bashful young gentleman in question, which we noted particularly, with the view of ascertaining whether we were right in our conjecture. The young gentleman seated himself at table with evident misgivings, and turning sharp round to pay attention to some observation of his loquacious neighbour, overset his bread. There was nothing very bad in this, and if he had had the presence of mind to let it go, and say nothing about it, nobody but the man who had laid the cloth would have been a bit the wiser, but the young gentleman in various semi-successful attempts to prevent its fall, played with it a little, as gentlemen in the streets may be seen to do with their hats on a windy day, and then giving the roll a smart rap in his anxiety to catch it, knocked it with great adroitness into a tureen of white soup. At some distance, to the unspeakable terror and disturbance of a very amiable bald gentleman, who was dispensing the contents. We thought the bashful young gentleman would have gone off in an apoplectic fit, consequent upon the violent rush of blood to his face at the occurrence of this catastrophe. From this moment we perceived, in the phraseology of the fancy, that it was all up with the bashful young gentleman, and so indeed it was. Several benevolent persons endeavoured to relieve his embarrassment by taking wine with him, but finding that it only augmented his sufferings, and that after mingling sherry, champagne, hock and moselle together, he applied the greater part of the mixture externally, instead of internally, they gradually dropped off, and left him to the exclusive care of the talkative lady, who, not noting the wildness of his eye, firmly believed she had secured a listener. He broke a glass or two in the course of the meal, and disappeared shortly afterwards. It is inferred that he went away in some confusion, inasmuch as he left the house in another gentleman's coat, and the footman's hat. This little incident led us to reflect upon the most prominent characteristics of bashful young gentlemen in the abstract, and as this portable volume will be the great textbook of young ladies in all future generations, we record them here for their guidance and behoof. If the bashful young gentleman, in turning a street corner, chanced to stumble suddenly upon 2 or 3 young ladies of his acquaintance, nothing can exceed his confusion and agitation. His first impulse is to make a great variety of bows, and dart past them, which he does until, observing that they wish to stop, but are uncertain whether to do so or not, he makes several feints of returning, which causes them to do the same, and at length, after a great quantity of unnecessary dodging and falling up against the other passengers, he returns and shakes hands most affectionately with all of them, in doing which he knocks out of their grasp sundry little parcels, which he hastily picks up, and returns very muddy and disordered. The chances are that the bashful young gentleman then observes it is very fine weather, and being reminded that it has only just left off raining for the first time these 3 days, he blushes very much, and smiles as if he had said a very good thing. The young lady who was most anxious to speak, here inquires, with an air of great commiseration, how his dear sister Harriet is today, to which the young gentleman, without the slightest consideration, replies with many thanks, that she is remarkably well. Well, Mr. Hopkins, cries the young lady, why, we heard she was bled yesterday evening, and have been perfectly miserable about her. Oh, ah, says the young gentleman, so she was. Oh, she's very ill indeed. The young gentleman then shakes his head, and looks very desponding. He has been smiling perpetually up to this time, and after a short pause, gives his glove a great wrench at the wrist, and says, with a strong emphasis on the adjective, good morning, and making a great number of bows in acknowledgement of several little messages to his sister, walks backward a few paces, and comes with great violence against a lamp post, knocking his hat off in the contact, which in his mental confusion and bodily pain he is going to walk away without, until a great roar from a carter attracts his attention, when he picks it up, and tries to smile cheerfully to the young ladies, who are looking back, and who, he has the satisfaction of seeing, are all laughing heartily. At a quadrille party, the bashful young gentleman always remains as near the entrance of the room as possible, from which position he smiles at the people he knows as they come in, and sometimes steps forward to shake hands with more intimate friends, a process which on each repetition seems to turn him a deeper scarlet than before. He declines dancing the first set or 2, observing, in a faint voice, that he would rather wait a little, but at length is absolutely compelled to allow himself to be introduced to a partner, when he is led, in a great heat and blushing furiously, across the room to a spot where half a dozen unknown ladies are congregated together. Miss Lambert, let me introduce Mr. Hopkins for the next quadrille. Miss Lambert inclines her head graciously. Mr. Hopkins bows, and his fair conductress disappears, leaving Mr. Hopkins, as he too well knows, to make himself agreeable. The young lady more than half expects that the bashful young gentleman will say something, and the bashful young gentleman feeling this, seriously thinks whether he has got anything to say, which, upon mature reflection, he is rather disposed to conclude he has not, since nothing occurs to him. Meanwhile, the young lady, after several inspections of her bouquet, all made in the expectation that the bashful young gentleman is going to talk, whispers her mamma, who is sitting next her, which whisper the bashful young gentleman immediately suspects, and possibly with very good reason, must be about him. In this comfortable condition he remains until it is time to stand up, when murmuring will you allow me, he gives the young lady his arm, and after inquiring where she will stand, and receiving a reply that she has no choice, conducts her to the remotest corner of the quadrille, and making one attempt at conversation, which turns out a desperate failure, preserves a profound silence until it is all over, when he walks her twice round the room, deposits her in her old seat, and retires in confusion. A married bashful gentleman, for these bashful gentlemen do get married sometimes. How it is ever brought about, is a mystery to us. A married bashful gentleman either causes his wife to appear bold by contrast, or merges her proper importance in his own insignificance. Bashful young gentlemen should be cured, or avoided. They are never hopeless, and never will be, while female beauty and attractions retain their influence, as any young lady will find, who may think it worthwhile on this confident assurance to take a patient in hand. The out-and-out young gentleman. Out-and-out young gentlemen may be divided into two classes: those who have something to do, and those who have nothing. I shall commence with the former, because that species come more frequently under the notice of young ladies, whom it is our province to warn and to instruct. The out-and-out young gentleman is usually no great dresser, his instructions to his tailor being all comprehended in the one general direction to make that what's a name a regular bang-up sort of thing. For some years past, the favorite costume of the out-and-out young gentleman has been a rough pilot coat, with 2 gilt hooks and eyes to the velvet collar, buttons somewhat larger than crown pieces, a black or fancy neckerchief, loosely tied, a wide-brimmed hat, with a low crown, tightish inexpressibles, and iron-shod boots. Out of doors he sometimes carries a large ash stick, but only on special occasions, for he prefers keeping his hands in his coat pockets. He smokes at all hours, of course, and swears considerably. The out-and-out young gentleman is employed in a city counting-house or solicitor's office, in which he does as little as he possibly can. His chief places of resort are the streets, the taverns, and the theatres. In the streets at evening time, out-and-out young gentlemen have a pleasant custom of walking 6 or 8 abreast, thus driving females and other inoffensive persons into the road, which never fails to afford them the highest satisfaction, especially if there be any immediate danger of their being run over, which enhances the fun of the thing materially. In all places of public resort, the out-and-outers are careful to select each a seat to himself, upon which he lies at full length, and, if the weather be very dirty, but not in any other case, he lies with his knees up, and the solace of his boots planted firmly on the cushion, so that if any low fellow should ask him to make room for a lady, he takes ample revenge upon her dress, without going at all out of his way to do it. He always sits with his hat on, and flourishes his stick in the air while the play is proceeding, with the dignified contempt of the performance. If it be possible for 1 or 2 out-and-out young gentlemen to get up a little crowding in the passages, they are quite in their element, squeezing, pushing, whooping, and shouting in the most humorous manner possible. If they can only succeed in irritating the gentleman who has a family of daughters under his charge, they are like to die with laughing, and boast of it among their companions for a week afterwards, adding, that 1 or 2 of them were devilish fine girls, and that they really thought the youngest would have fainted, which was the only thing wanted to render the joke complete. If the out-and-out young gentleman have a mother and sisters, of course he treats them with becoming contempt, inasmuch as they, poor things, having no notion of life or gaiety, are far too weak-spirited and moping for him. Sometimes, however, on a birthday or at Christmas time, he cannot very well help accompanying them to a party at some old friend's, with which view he comes home when they have been dressed an hour or 2, smelling very strongly of tobacco and spirits, and after exchanging his rough coat for some more suitable attire, in which however he loses nothing of the out-and-outer, gets into the coach and grumbles all the way at his own good nature, his bitter reflections aggravated by the recollection, that Tom Smith has taken the chair at a little impromptu dinner at a fighting man's, and that a set-to was to take place on a dining table, between the fighting man and his brother-in-law, which is probably coming off at that very instant. As the out-and-out young gentleman is by no means at his ease in ladies' society, he shrinks into a corner of the drawing-room when they reach the friends, and unless one of his sisters is kind enough to talk to him, remains there without being much troubled by the attentions of other people, until he espies, lingering outside the door, another gentleman, whom he at once knows, by his air and manner, for there is a kind of freemasonry in the craft, to be a brother out-and-outer, and towards whom he accordingly makes his way. Conversation being soon opened by some casual remark, the second out-and-outer confidentially informs the first, that he is one of the rough sort and hates that kind of thing, only he couldn't very well be off coming, to which the other replies, that that's just his case, and I'll tell you what, continues the out-and-outer in a whisper, I should like a glass of warm brandy and water just now, or a pint of stout and a pipe, suggests the other out-and-outer. The discovery is at once made that they are sympathetic souls, each of them says at the same moment, that he sees the other understands what's what, and they become fast friends at once, more especially when it appears, that the second out-and-outer is no other than a gentleman, long favourably known to his familiars as Mr. Warmont Blake, who upon divers occasions has distinguished himself in a manner that would not have disgraced the fighting man, and who having been a pretty long time about town had the honour of once shaking hands with the celebrated Mr. Thursdale himself. At supper, these gentlemen greatly distinguish themselves, brightening up very much when the ladies leave the table, and proclaiming aloud their intention of beginning to spend the evening, a process which is generally understood to be satisfactorily performed, when a great deal of wine is drunk and a great deal of noise made, both of which feats the out-and-out young gentlemen execute to perfection. Having protracted their sitting until long after the host and the other guests have adjourned to the drawing-room, and finding that they have drained the decanters empty, they follow them thither with complexions rather heightened, and faces rather bloated with wine, and the agitated lady of the house whispers her friends as they waltz together, to the great terror of the whole room, that both Mr. Blake and Mr. Dummins are very nice sort of young men in their way, only they are eccentric persons, and unfortunately rather too wild. The remaining class of out-and-out young gentlemen is composed of persons, who, having no money of their own and a soul above earning any, enjoy similar pleasures, nobody knows how. These respectable gentlemen, without aiming quite so much at the out in external appearance, are distinguished by all the same amiable and attractive characteristics, in an equal or perhaps greater degree, and now and then find their way into society, through the medium of the other class of out young gentlemen, who will sometimes carry them home, and who usually pay their tavern bills. As they are equally gentlemanly, clever, witty, intelligent, wise, and well-bred, we need scarcely have recommended them to the peculiar consideration of the young ladies, if it were not that some of the gentle creatures whom we hold in such high respect, are perhaps a little too apt to confound a great many heavier terms with the light word eccentricity, which we beg them henceforth to take in a strictly Johnsonian sense, without any liberality or latitude of construction. The very friendly young gentleman. We know, and all people know, so many specimens of this class, that in selecting the few heads our limits enable us to take from a great number, we have been induced to give the very friendly young gentleman the preference over many others, to whose claims upon a more cursory view of the question we had felt disposed to assign the priority. The very friendly young gentleman is very friendly to everybody, but he attaches himself particularly to 2, or at most to 3 families, regulating his choice by their dinners, their circle of acquaintance, or some other criterion in which he has an immediate interest. He is of any age between 20 and 40, unmarried of course, must be fond of children, and is expected to make himself generally useful if possible. Let us illustrate our meaning by an example, which is the shortest mode and the clearest. We encountered one day, by chance, an old friend of whom we had lost sight for some years, and who, expressing a strong anxiety to renew our former intimacy, urged us to dine with him on an early day, that we might talk over old times. We readily assented, adding, that we hoped we should be alone. "Oh, certainly, certainly," said our friend, "not a soul with us but Minson." "And who is Minson?" was our natural inquiry. "Oh, don't mind him," replied our friend, "he's a most particular friend of mine, and a very friendly fellow you will find him," and so he left us. We thought no more about Minson until we duly presented ourselves at the house next day, when, after a hearty welcome, our friend motioned towards a gentleman who had been previously showing his teeth by the fireplace, and gave us to understand that it was Mr. Minson, of whom he had spoken. It required no great penetration on our part to discover at once that Mr. Minson was in every respect a very friendly young gentleman. "I am delighted," said Minson, hastily advancing, and pressing our hand warmly between both of his, "I am delighted, I am sure, to make your acquaintance." Here he smiled, very much delighted indeed. Here he exhibited a little emotion. "I assure you that I have looked forward to it anxiously for a very long time." Here he released our hands, and rubbing his own, observed, that the day was severe, but that he was delighted to perceive from our appearance that it agreed with us wonderfully, and then went on to observe, that, notwithstanding the coldness of the weather, he had that morning seen in the paper an exceedingly curious paragraph, to the effect, that there was now in the garden of Mr. Wilkins of Chichester, a pumpkin, measuring 4 feet in height, and 11 feet 7 inches in circumference, which he looked upon as a very extraordinary piece of intelligence. We ventured to remark, that we had a dim recollection of having once or twice before observed a similar paragraph in the public prints, upon which Mr. Minson took us confidentially by the button, and said, "Exactly, exactly, to be sure, we were very right," and he wondered what the editors meant by putting in such things. Who the deuce, he should like to know, did they suppose cared about them? That struck him as being the best of it. The lady of the house appeared shortly afterwards, and Mr. Minson's friendliness, as will readily be supposed, suffered no diminution in consequence. He exerted much strength and skill in wheeling a large easy chair up to the fire, and the lady being seated in it, carefully closed the door, stirred the fire, and looked to the windows to see that they admitted no air. Having satisfied himself upon all these points, he expressed himself quite easy in his mind, and begged to know how she found herself today. Upon the lady's replying very well, Mr. Minson, who it appeared was a medical gentleman, offered some general remarks upon the nature and treatment of colds in the head, which occupied us agreeably until dinner time. During the meal, he devoted himself to complimenting everybody, not forgetting himself, so that we were an uncommonly agreeable quartet. "I'll tell you what, Capper," said Mr. Minson to our host, as he closed the room door after the lady had retired, "you have very great reason to be fond of your wife." "Sweet woman, Mrs. Capper, sir." "Nay, Minson, I beg," interposed the host, as we were about to reply that Mrs. Capper unquestionably was particularly sweet. "Pray, Minson, don't." "Why not?" exclaimed Mr. Minson, "why not? Why should you feel any delicacy before your old friend, our old friend, if I may be allowed to call you so, sir? Why should you, I ask?" We of course wished to know why he should also, upon which our friend admitted that Mrs. Capper was a very sweet woman, at which admission Mr. Minson cried bravo, and begged to propose Mrs. Capper with heartfelt enthusiasm, whereupon our host said, "Thank you, Minson," with deep feeling, and gave us, in a low voice, to understand, that Minson had saved Mrs. Capper's cousin's life no less than 14 times in a year and a half, which he considered no common circumstance, an opinion to which we most cordially subscribed. Now that we three were left to entertain ourselves with conversation, Mr. Minson's extreme friendliness became every moment more apparent. He was so amazingly friendly, indeed, that it was impossible to talk about anything in which he had not the chief concern. We happened to allude to some affairs in which our friend and we had been mutually engaged nearly 14 years before, when Mr. Minson was all at once reminded of a joke which our friend had made on that day 4 years, which he positively must insist upon telling, and which he did tell accordingly, with many pleasant recollections of what he said, and what Mrs. Capper said, and how he well remembered that they had been to the play with orders on the very night previous, and had seen Romeo and Juliet, and the pantomime, and how Mrs. Capper, being faint, had been led into the lobby, where she smiled, said it was nothing after all, and went back again, with many other interesting and absorbing particulars, after which the friendly young gentleman went on to assure us, that our friend had experienced a marvellously prophetic opinion of that same pantomime, which was of such an admirable kind, that 2 morning papers took the same view next day. To this our friend replied, with a little triumph, that in that instance he had some reason to think he had been correct, which gave the friendly young gentleman occasion to believe that our friend was always correct, and so we went on, until our friend, filling a bumper, said he must drink 1 glass to his dear friend Minson, than whom he would say no man saved the lives of his acquaintances more, or had a more friendly heart. Finally, our friend, having emptied his glass, said, "God bless you, Minson, and Mr. Minson," and he shook hands across the table with much affection and earnestness. But great as the friendly young gentleman is, in a limited scene like this, he plays the same part on a larger scale with increased eclat. Mr. Minson is invited to an evening party with his dear friends the Martins, where he meets his dear friends the Cappers, and his dear friends the Watsons, and 100 other dear friends too numerous to mention. He is as much at home with the Martins as with the Cappers, but how exquisitely he balances his attentions, and divides them among his dear friends. If he flirts with one of the Miss Watsons, he has one little Martin on the sofa pulling his hair, and the other little Martin on the carpet riding on his foot. He carries Mrs. Watson down to supper on one arm, and Miss Martin on the other, and takes wine so judiciously, and in such exact order, that it is impossible for the most punctilious old lady to consider herself neglected. If any young lady, being prevailed upon to sing, become nervous afterwards, Mr. Minson leads her tenderly into the next room, and restores her with port wine, which she must take medicinally. If any gentleman be standing by the piano during the progress of the ballad, Mr. Minson seizes him by the arm at one point of the melody, and softly beating time the while with his head, expresses in dumb show his intense perception of the delicacy of the passage. If anybody's self-love is to be flattered, Mr. Minson is at hand. If anybody's overweening vanity is to be pampered, Mr. Minson will surfeit it. What wonder that people of all stations and ages recognize Mr. Minson's friendliness, that he is universally allowed to be handsome as amiable, that mothers think him an oracle, daughters a dear, brothers a beau, and fathers a wonder. And who would not have the reputation of the very friendly young gentleman? The military young gentleman. We are rather at a loss to imagine how it has come to pass that military young gentlemen have obtained so much favour in the eyes of the young ladies of this kingdom. We cannot think so lightly of them as to suppose that the mere circumstance of a man's wearing a red coat ensures him a ready passport to their regard, and even if this were the case, it would be no satisfactory explanation of the circumstance, because, although the analogy may in some degree hold good in the case of male coachmen and guards, still general postmen wear red coats, and they are not to our knowledge better received than other men, nor are firemen either, who wear, or used to wear, not only red coats, but very resplendent and massive badges besides much larger than epaulets. Neither do the twopenny post office boys, if the result of our inquiries be correct, find any peculiar favour in women's eyes, although they wear very bright red jackets, and have the additional advantage of constantly appearing in public on horseback, which last circumstance may be naturally supposed to be greatly in their favour. We have sometimes thought that this phenomenon may take its rise in the conventional behaviour of captains and colonels and other gentlemen in red coats on the stage, where they are invariably represented as fine swaggering fellows, talking of nothing but charming girls, their king and country, their honour, and their debts, and crowing over the inferior classes of the community, whom they occasionally treat with a little gentlemanly swindling, no less to the improvement and pleasure of the audience, than to the satisfaction and approval of the choice spirits who consort with them. But we will not devote these pages to our speculations upon the subject, inasmuch as our business at the present moment is not so much with the young ladies who are bewitched by Her Majesty's livery as with the young gentlemen whose heads are turned by it. For heads we had written brains, but upon consideration, we think the former the more appropriate word of the two. These young gentlemen may be divided into 2 classes: young gentlemen who are actually in the army, and young gentlemen who, having an intense and enthusiastic admiration for all things appertaining to a military life, are compelled by adverse fortune or adverse relations to wear out their existence in some ignoble counting house. We will take this latter description of military young gentlemen first. The whole heart and soul of the military young gentleman are concentrated in his favourite topic. There is nothing that he is so learned upon as uniforms, he will tell you, without faltering for an instant, what the habiliments of any one regiment are turned up with, what regiment wears stripes down the outside and inside of the leg, and how many buttons the 10th had on their coats. He knows to a fraction how many yards and odd inches of gold lace it takes to make an ensign in the Guards, is deeply read in the comparative merits of different bands, and the appareling of trumpeters, and is very luminous indeed in descanting upon crack regiments, and the crack gentlemen who compose them, of whose mightiness and grandeur he is never tired of telling. We were suggesting to a military young gentleman only the other day, after he had related to us several dazzling instances of the profusion of half a dozen honourable ensign somebodies or nobodies in the articles of kid gloves and polished boots, that possibly cracked regiments would be an improvement upon crack, as being a more expressive and appropriate designation, when he suddenly interrupted us by pulling out his watch, and observing that he must hurry off to the park in a cab, or he would be too late to hear the band play. Not wishing to interfere with so important an engagement, and being in fact already slightly overwhelmed by the anecdotes of the honourable ensigns aforementioned, we made no attempt to detain the military young gentleman, but parted company with ready good will. Some 3 or 4 hours afterwards, we chanced to be walking down Whitehall, on the Admiralty side of the way, when, as we drew near to one of the little stone places in which a couple of horse soldiers mount guard in the daytime, we were attracted by the motionless appearance and eager gaze of a young gentleman, who was devouring both man and horse with his eyes, so eagerly, that he seemed deaf and blind to all that was passing around him. We were not much surprised at the discovery that it was our friend, the military young gentleman, but we were a little astonished when we returned from a walk to South Lambeth to find him still there, looking on with the same intensity as before. As it was a very windy day, we felt bound to awaken the young gentleman from his reverie, when he inquired of us with great enthusiasm, whether that was not a glorious spectacle, and proceeded to give us a detailed account of the weight of every article of the spectacle's trappings, from the man's gloves to the horse's shoes. We have made it a practice since, to take the horse guards in our daily walk, and we find it is the custom of military young gentlemen to plant themselves opposite the sentries, and contemplate them at leisure, in periods varying from 15 minutes to 50, and averaging 25. We were much struck a day or two since, by the behaviour of a very promising young butcher who, evincing an interest in the service, which cannot be too strongly commended or encouraged, after a prolonged inspection of the sentry, proceeded to handle his boots with great curiosity, and as much composure and indifference as if the man were waxwork. But the really military young gentleman is waiting all this time, and at the very moment that an apology rises to our lips, he emerges from the barrack gate. He is quartered in a garrison town, and takes the way towards the High Street. He wears his undress uniform, which somewhat mars the glory of his outward man, but still how great, how grand, he is. What a happy mixture of ease and ferocity in his gait and carriage, and how lightly he carries that dreadful sword under his arm, making no more ado about it than if it were a silk umbrella. The lion is sleeping, only think if an enemy were in sight, how soon he'd whip it out of the scabbard, and what a terrible fellow he would be. But he walks on, thinking of nothing less than blood and slaughter, and now he comes in sight of 3 other military young gentlemen, arm in arm, who are bearing down towards him, clanking their iron heels on the pavement, and clashing their swords with a noise, which should cause all peaceful men to quail at heart. They stop to talk. See how the flaxen-haired young gentleman with the weak legs, he who has his pocket-handkerchief thrust into the breast of his coat, glares upon the faint-hearted civilians who linger to look upon his glory, how the next young gentleman elevates his head in the air, and majestically places his arms akimbo, while the third stands with his legs very wide apart, and clasps his hands behind him. Well may we inquire, not in familiar jest, but in respectful earnest, if you call that nothing. Oh! If some encroaching foreign power, the Emperor of Russia, for instance, or any of those deep fellows, could only see those military young gentlemen as they move on together towards the billiard room over the way, wouldn't he tremble a little? And then, at the theatre at night, when the performances are by command of Colonel Fitz-Sordust and the officers of the garrison, what a splendid sight it is! How sternly the defenders of their country look round the house, as if in mute assurance to the audience, that they may make themselves comfortable regarding any foreign invasion, for they, the military young gentlemen, are keeping a sharp lookout, and are ready for anything. And what a contrast between them, and that stage box full of grey-headed officers with tokens of many battles about them, who have nothing at all in common with the military young gentlemen, and who but for an old-fashioned kind of manly dignity in their looks and bearing might be common hard-working soldiers for anything they take the pains to announce to the contrary. Ah! Here is a family just come in who recognize the flaxen-headed young gentleman, and the flaxen-headed young gentleman recognizes them too, only he doesn't care to show it just now. Very well done indeed. He talks louder to the little group of military young gentlemen who are standing by him, and coughs to induce some ladies in the next box but one to look round, in order that their faces may undergo the same ordeal of criticism to which they have subjected, in not a wholly inaudible tone, the majority of the female portion of the audience. Oh! A gentleman in the same box looks round as if he were disposed to resent this as an impertinence, and the flaxen-headed young gentleman sees his friends at once, and hurries away to them with the most charming cordiality. 3 young ladies, 1 young man, and the mamma of the party, receive the military young gentleman with great warmth and politeness, and in 5 minutes afterwards the military young gentleman, stimulated by the mamma, introduces the two other military young gentlemen with whom he was walking in the morning, who take their seats behind the young ladies and commence conversation, whereat the mamma bestows a triumphant bow upon a rival mamma, who has not succeeded in decoying any military young gentleman, and prepares to consider her visitors from that moment three of the most elegant and superior young gentlemen in the whole world. The political young gentleman. Once upon a time, not in the days when pigs drank wine, but in a more recent period of our history, it was customary to banish politics when ladies were present. If this usage still prevailed, we should have had no chapter for political young gentlemen, for ladies would have neither known nor cared what kind of monster a political young gentleman was. But as this good custom in common with many others has gone out, and left no word when it is likely to be home again, as political young ladies are by no means rare, and political young gentlemen the very reverse of scarce, we are bound in the strict discharge of our most responsible duty not to neglect this natural division of our subject. If the political young gentleman be resident in a country town, and there are political young gentlemen in country towns sometimes, he is wholly absorbed in his politics, as a pair of purple spectacles communicate the same uniform tint to all objects near and remote, so the political glasses, with which the young gentleman assists his mental vision, give to everything the hue and tinge of party feeling. The political young gentleman would as soon think of being struck with the beauty of a young lady in the opposite interest, as he would dream of marrying his sister to the opposite member. If the political young gentleman be a conservative, he has usually some vague ideas about Ireland and the Pope which he cannot very clearly explain, but which he knows are the right sort of thing, and not to be very easily got over by the other side. He has also some choice sentences regarding church and state, culled from the banners in use at the last election, with which he intersperses his conversation at intervals with surprising effect. But his great topic is the Constitution, upon which he will declaim, by the hour together, with much heat and fury, not that he has any particular information on the subject, but because he knows that the Constitution is somehow church and state somehow the Constitution, and that the fellows on the other side say it isn't, which is quite a sufficient reason for him to say it is, and to stick to it. Perhaps his greatest topic of all, though, is the people. If a fight takes place in a populous town, in which many noses are broken, and a few windows, the young gentleman throws down the newspaper with a triumphant air, and exclaims, "Here's your precious people." If half a dozen boys run across the course at race time, when it ought to be kept clear, the young gentleman looks indignantly round, and begs you to observe the conduct of the people. If the gallery demand a hornpipe between the play and the after-piece, the same young gentleman cries no end shame till he is hoarse, and then inquires with a sneer what you think of popular moderation now. In short, the people form a never-failing theme for him, and when the attorney, on the side of his candidate, dwells upon it with great power of eloquence at election time, as he never fails to do, the young gentleman and his friends, and the body they head, cheer with great violence against the other people, with whom, of course, they have no possible connection. In much the same manner the audience at a theatre never fail to be highly amused with any jokes at the expense of the public, always laughing heartily at some other public, and never at themselves. If the political young gentleman be a radical, he is usually a very profound person indeed, having great store of theoretical questions to put to you, with an infinite variety of possible cases and logical deductions therefrom. If he be of the utilitarian school, too, which is more than probable, he is particularly pleasant company, having many ingenious remarks to offer upon the voluntary principle and various cheerful disquisitions connected with the population of the country, the position of Great Britain in the scale of nations, and the balance of power. Then he is exceedingly well versed in all doctrines of political economy as laid down in the newspapers, and knows a great many parliamentary speeches by heart. Nay, he has a small stock of aphorisms, none of them exceeding a couple of lines in length, which will settle the toughest question and leave you nothing to say. He gives all the young ladies to understand, that Miss Martineau is the greatest woman that ever lived, and when they praise the good looks of Mr. Hawkins the new member, says he's very well for a representative, all things considered, but he wants a little calling to account, and he is more than half afraid it will be necessary to bring him down on his knees for that vote on the miscellaneous estimates. At this, the young ladies express much wonderment, and say surely a member of Parliament is not to be brought upon his knees so easily, in reply to which the political young gentleman smiles sternly, and throws out dark hints regarding the speedy arrival of that day, when members of Parliament will be paid salaries, and required to render weekly accounts of their proceedings, at which the young ladies utter many expressions of astonishment and incredulity, while their lady mothers regard the prophecy as little else than blasphemous. It is extremely improving and interesting to hear two political young gentlemen, of diverse opinions, discuss some great question across a dinner table, such as, whether, if the public were admitted to Westminster Abbey for nothing, they would or would not convey small chisels and hammers in their pockets, and immediately set about chipping all the noses off the statues, or whether, if they once got into the Tower for a shilling, they would not insist upon trying the crown on their own heads, and loading and firing off all the small arms in the armory, to the great discomposure of Whitechapel and the Minories. Upon these, and many other momentous questions which agitate the public mind in these desperate days, they will discourse with great vehemence and irritation for a considerable time together, both leaving off precisely where they began, and each thoroughly persuaded that he has got the better of the other. In society, at assemblies, balls, and playhouses, these political young gentlemen are perpetually on the watch for a political allusion, or anything which can be tortured or construed into being one, when, thrusting themselves into the very smallest openings for their favourite discourse, they fall upon the unhappy company tooth and nail. They have recently had many favourable opportunities of opening in churches, but as there the clergyman has it all his own way, and must not be contradicted, whatever politics he preaches, they are fain to hold their tongues until they reach the outer door, though at the imminent risk of bursting in the effort. As such discussions can please nobody but the talkative parties concerned, we hope they will henceforth take the hint and discontinue them, otherwise we now give them warning, that the ladies have our advice to discountenance such talkers altogether. The domestic young gentleman. Let us make a slight sketch of our amiable friend, Mr. Felix Nixon. We are strongly disposed to think, that if we put him in this place, he will answer our purpose without another word of comment. Felix, then, is a young gentleman who lives at home with his mother, just within the twopenny post office circle of 3 miles from St. Martin le Grand. He wears India rubber goloshes when the weather is at all damp, and always has a silk handkerchief neatly folded up in the right-hand pocket of his great coat, to tie over his mouth when he goes home at night. Moreover, being rather nearsighted, he carries spectacles for particular occasions, and has a weakish tremulous voice, of which he makes great use, for he talks as much as any old lady breathing. The two chief subjects of Felix's discourse, are himself and his mother, both of whom would appear to be very wonderful and interesting persons. As Felix and his mother are seldom apart in body, so Felix and his mother are scarcely ever separate in spirit. If you ask Felix how he finds himself today, he prefaces his reply with a long and minute bulletin of his mother's state of health, and the good lady in her turn, edifies her acquaintance with a circumstantial and alarming account, how he sneezed 4 times and coughed once after being out in the rain the other night, but having his feet promptly put into hot water, and his head into a flannel something, which we will not describe more particularly than by this delicate allusion, was happily brought round by the next morning, and enabled to go to business as usual. Our friend is not a very adventurous or hot-headed person, but he has passed through many dangers, as his mother can testify. There is one great story in particular, concerning a hackney coachman who wanted to overcharge him one night for bringing them home from the play, upon which Felix gave the aforesaid coachman a look which his mother thought would have crushed him to the earth, but which did not crush him quite, for he continued to demand another 6pence, notwithstanding that Felix took out his pocket-book, and, with the aid of a flat candle, pointed out the fare in print, which the coachman obstinately disregarding, he shut the street door with a slam which his mother shudders to think of, and then, roused to the most appalling pitch of passion by the coachman knocking a double knock to show that he was by no means convinced, he broke with uncontrollable force from his parent and the servant girl, and running into the street without his hat, actually shook his fist at the coachman, and came back again with a face as white, Mrs. Nixon says, looking about her for a simile, as white as that ceiling. She never will forget his fury that night, never. To this account Felix listens with a solemn face, occasionally looking at you to see how it affects you, and when his mother has made an end of it, adds that he looked at every coachman he met for 3 weeks afterwards, in hopes that he might see the scoundrel, whereupon Mrs. Nixon, with an exclamation of terror, requests to know what he would have done to him if he had seen him, at which Felix smiling darkly and clenching his right fist, she exclaims, "Goodness gracious," with a distracted air, and insists upon extorting a promise that he never will on any account do anything so rash, which her dutiful son, it being something more than 3 years since the offence was committed, reluctantly concedes, and his mother, shaking her head prophetically, fears with a sigh that his spirit will lead him into something violent yet. The discourse then, by an easy transition, turns upon the spirit which glows within the bosom of Felix, upon which point Felix himself becomes eloquent, and relates a thrilling anecdote of the time when he used to sit up till 2 o'clock in the morning reading French, and how his mother used to say, "Felix, you will make yourself ill, I know you will," and how he used to say, "Mother, I don't care, I will do it," and how at last his mother privately procured a doctor to come and see him, who declared, the moment he felt his pulse, that if he had gone on reading one night more, only one night more, he must have put a blister on each temple, and another between his shoulders, and who, as it was, sat down upon the instant, and writing a prescription for a blue pill, said it must be taken immediately, or he wouldn't answer for the consequences. The recital of these and many other moving perils of the like nature, constantly harrows up the feelings of Mr. Nixon's friends. Mrs. Nixon has a tolerably extensive circle of female acquaintance, being a good-humoured, talkative, bustling little body, and to the unmarried girls among them she is constantly vaunting the virtues of her son, hinting that she will be a very happy person who wins him, but that they must mind their Ps and Qs, for he is very particular, and terribly severe upon young ladies. At this last caution the young ladies resident in the same row, who happen to be spending the evening there, put their pocket handkerchiefs before their mouths, and are troubled with a short cough. Just then Felix knocks at the door, and his mother, drawing the tea-table near the fire, calls out to him as he takes off his boots in the back parlour that he needn't mind coming in his slippers, for there are only the 2 Miss Greys and Miss Thompson, and she is quite sure they will excuse him. And nodding to the two Miss Greys, she adds, in a whisper, that Julia Thompson is a great favourite with Felix, at which intelligence the short cough comes again, and Miss Thompson in particular is greatly troubled with it, till Felix coming in, very faint for want of his tea, changes the subject of discourse, and enables her to laugh out boldly and tell Amelia Grey not to be so foolish. Here they all three laugh, and Mrs. Nixon says they are giddy girls, in which stage of the proceedings, Felix, who has by this time refreshed himself with the grateful herb that cheers but not inebriates, removes his cup from his countenance and says with a knowing smile, that all girls are, whereat his admiring mamma pats him on the back and tells him not to be sly, which calls forth a general laugh from the young ladies, and another smile from Felix, who, thinking he looks very sly indeed, is perfectly satisfied. Tea being over, the young ladies resume their work, and Felix insists upon holding a skein of silk while Miss Thompson winds it on a card. This process having been performed to the satisfaction of all parties, he brings down his flute in compliance with a request from the youngest Miss Grey, and plays divers tunes out of a very small music book till supper time, when he is very facetious and talkative indeed. Finally, after half a tumblerful of warm sherry and water, he gallantly puts on his goloshes over his slippers, and telling Miss Thompson's servant to run on first and get the door open, escorts that young lady to her house, 5 doors off, the Miss Greys who live in the next house but one stopping to peep with merry faces from their own door till he comes back again, when they call out very well, Mr. Felix, and trip into the passage with a laugh more musical than any flute that was ever played. Felix is rather prim in his appearance, and perhaps a little priggish about his books and flute, and so forth, which have all their peculiar corners of peculiar shelves in his bedroom. Indeed all his female acquaintance, and they are good judges, have long ago set him down as a thorough old bachelor. He is a favourite with them however, in a certain way, as an honest, inoffensive, kind-hearted creature, and as his peculiarities harm nobody, not even himself, we are induced to hope that many who are not personally acquainted with him will take our good word in his behalf, and be content to leave him to a long continuance of his harmless existence. The censorious young gentleman. There is an amiable kind of young gentleman going about in society, upon whom, after much experience of him, and considerable turning over of the subject in our mind, we feel it our duty to affix the above appellation. Young ladies mildly call him a sarcastic young gentleman, or a severe young gentleman. We, who know better, beg to acquaint them with the fact, that he is merely a censorious young gentleman, and nothing else. The censorious young gentleman has the reputation among his familiars of a remarkably clever person, which he maintains by receiving all intelligence and expressing all opinions with a dubious sneer, accompanied with a half-smile, expressive of anything you please but good humour. This sets people about thinking what on earth the censorious young gentleman means, and they speedily arrive at the conclusion that he means something very deep indeed, for they reason in this way: this young gentleman looks so very knowing that he must mean something, and as I am by no means a dull individual, what a very deep meaning he must have if I can't find it out. It is extraordinary how soon a censorious young gentleman may make a reputation in his own small circle if he bear this in his mind, and regulate his proceedings accordingly. As young ladies are generally not curious, but laudably desirous to acquire information, the censorious young gentleman is much talked about among them, and many surmises are hazarded regarding him. I wonder, exclaims the eldest Miss Greenwood, laying down her work to turn up the lamp, I wonder whether Mr. Fairfax will ever be married. Bless me, dear, cries Miss Marshall, whatever made you think of him? Really I hardly know, replies Miss Greenwood, he is such a very mysterious person, that I often wonder about him. Well, to tell you the truth, replies Miss Marshall, and so do I. Here 2 other young ladies profess that they are constantly doing the like, and all present appear in the same condition except one young lady, who, not scrupling to state that she considers Mr. Fairfax a horror, draws down all the opposition of the others, which having been expressed in a great many ejaculatory passages, such as, well, did I ever? And lor, Emily, dear, Ma takes up the subject, and gravely states, that she must say she does not think Mr. Fairfax by any means a horror, but rather takes him to be a young man of very great ability, and I am quite sure, adds the worthy lady, he always means a great deal more than he says. The door opens at this point of the disclosure, and who of all people alive walks into the room, but the very Mr. Fairfax, who has been the subject of conversation. Well, it really is curious, cries Ma, we were at that very moment talking about you. You did me great honour, replies Mr. Fairfax, may I venture to ask what you were saying? Why, if you must know, returns the eldest girl, we were remarking what a very mysterious man you are. I, observes Mr. Fairfax, indeed. Now Mr. Fairfax says this I and indeed, which are slight words enough in themselves, with so very unfathomable an air, and accompanies them with such a very equivocal smile, that Ma and the young ladies are more than ever convinced that he means an immensity, and so tell him he is a very dangerous man, and seems to be always thinking ill of somebody, which is precisely the sort of character the censorious young gentleman is most desirous to establish, wherefore he says, oh, dear, no, in a tone, obviously intended to mean, you have me there, and which gives them to understand that they have hit the right nail on the very center of its head. When the conversation ranges from the mystery overhanging the censorious young gentleman's behavior, to the general topics of the day, he sustains his character to admiration. He considers the new tragedy well enough for a new tragedy, but Lord bless us well, no matter, he could say a great deal on that point, but he would rather not, lest he should be thought ill-natured, as he knows he would be. But is not Mr. So-and-so's performance truly charming, inquires a young lady. Charming, replies the censorious young gentleman. Oh, dear, yes, certainly, very charming, oh, very charming indeed. After this, he stirs the fire, smiling contemptuously all the while, and a modest young gentleman, who has been a silent listener, thinks what a great thing it must be, to have such a critical judgment. Of music, pictures, books, and poetry, the censorious young gentleman has an equally fine conception. As to men and women, he can tell all about them at a glance. Now let us hear your opinion of young Mrs. Barker, says some great believer in the powers of Mr. Fairfax, but don't be too severe. I never am severe, replies the censorious young gentleman. Well, never mind that now. She is very ladylike, is she not? Ladylike, repeats the censorious young gentleman, for he always repeats when he is at a loss for anything to say. Did you observe her manner? Bless my heart and soul, Mrs. Thompson, did you observe her manner, that's all I ask. I thought I had done so, rejoins the poor lady, much perplexed, I did not observe it very closely perhaps. Oh, not very closely, rejoins the censorious young gentleman, triumphantly. Very good, then I did. Let us talk no more about her. The censorious young gentleman purses up his lips, and nods his head sagely, as he says this, and it is forthwith whispered about, that Mr. Fairfax, who, though he is a little prejudiced, must be admitted to be a very excellent judge, has observed something exceedingly odd in Mrs. Barker's manner. The funny young gentleman. As one funny young gentleman will serve as a sample of all funny young gentlemen, we purpose merely to note down the conduct and behavior of an individual specimen of this class, whom we happened to meet at an annual family Christmas party in the course of this very last Christmas that ever came. We were all seated round a blazing fire which crackled pleasantly as the guests talked merrily and the urn steamed cheerily, for, being an old-fashioned party, there was an urn, and a teapot besides, when there came a postman's knock at the door, so violent and sudden, that it startled the whole circle, and actually caused 2 or 3 very interesting and most unaffected young ladies to scream aloud and to exhibit many afflicting symptoms of terror and distress, until they had been several times assured by their respective adorers, that they were in no danger. We were about to remark that it was surely beyond post time, and must have been a runaway knock, when our host, who had hitherto been paralyzed with wonder, sank into a chair in a perfect ecstasy of laughter, and offered to lay £20 that it was that droll dog Griggs. He had no sooner said this, than the majority of the company and all the children of the house burst into a roar of laughter too, as if some inimitable joke flashed upon them simultaneously, and gave vent to various exclamations of to be sure it must be Griggs, and how like him that was, and what spirits he was always in, with many other commendatory remarks of the like nature. Not having the happiness to know Griggs, we became extremely desirous to see so pleasant a fellow, the more especially as a stout gentleman with a powdered head, who was sitting with his breeches buckles almost touching the hob, whispered us he was a wit of the first water, when the door opened, and Mr. Griggs being announced, presented himself, amidst another shout of laughter and a loud clapping of hands from the younger branches. This welcome he acknowledged by sundry contortions of countenance, imitative of the clown in one of the new pantomimes, which were so extremely successful, that one stout gentleman rolled upon an ottoman in a paroxysm of delight, protesting, with many gasps, that if somebody didn't make that fellow Griggs leave off, he would be the death of him, he knew. At this the company only laughed more boisterously than before, and as we always like to accommodate our tone and spirit if possible to the humour of any society in which we find ourselves, we laughed with the rest, and exclaimed, "Oh! Capital, capital," as loud as any of them. When he had quite exhausted all beholders, Mr. Griggs received the welcomes and congratulations of the circle, and went through the needful introductions with much ease and many puns. This ceremony over, he avowed his intention of sitting in somebody's lap unless the young ladies made room for him on the sofa, which being done, after a great deal of tittering and pleasantry, he squeezed himself among them, and likened his condition to that of love among the roses. At this novel jest we all roared once more. "You should consider yourself highly honoured, sir," said we. "Sir," replied Mr. Griggs, "you do me proud." Here everybody laughed again, and the stout gentleman by the fire whispered in our ear that Griggs was making a dead set at us. The tea things having been removed, we all sat down to a round game, and here Mr. Griggs shone forth with peculiar brilliancy, abstracting other people's fish, and looking over their hands in the most comical manner. He made one most excellent joke in snuffing a candle, which was neither more nor less than setting fire to the hair of a pale young gentleman who sat next him, and afterwards begging his pardon with considerable humour. As the young gentleman could not see the joke, however, possibly in consequence of its being on the top of his own head, it did not go off quite as well as it might have done. Indeed, the young gentleman was heard to murmur some general references to impertinence, and a rascal, and to state the number of his lodgings in an angry tone, a turn of the conversation which might have been productive of slaughterous consequences, if a young lady, betrothed to the young gentleman, had not used her immediate influence to bring about a reconciliation, emphatically declaring in an agitated whisper, intended for his peculiar edification but audible to the whole table, that if he went on in that way, she never would think of him otherwise than as a friend, though as that she must always regard him. At this terrible threat the young gentleman became calm, and the young lady, overcome by the revulsion of feeling, instantaneously fainted. Mr. Griggins's spirits were slightly depressed for a short period by this unlooked-for result of such a harmless pleasantry, but being promptly elevated by the attentions of the host and several glasses of wine, he soon recovered, and became even more vivacious than before, insomuch that the stout gentleman previously referred to, assured us that although he had known him since he was that high, something smaller than a nutmeg grater, he had never beheld him in such excellent cue. When the round game and several games at blind man's buff which followed it were all over, and we were going down to supper, the inexhaustible Mr. Griggens produced a small sprig of mistletoe from his waistcoat pocket, and commenced a general kissing of the assembled females, which occasioned great commotion and much excitement. We observed that several young gentlemen, including the young gentleman with the pale countenance, were greatly scandalized at this indecorous proceeding, and talked very big among themselves in corners, and we observed too, that several young ladies, when remonstrated with by the aforesaid young gentleman, called each other to witness how they had struggled, and protested vehemently that it was very rude, and that they were surprised at Mrs. Brown's allowing it, and that they couldn't bear it, and had no patience with such impertinence. But such is the gentle and forgiving nature of woman, that although we looked very narrowly for it, we could not detect the slightest harshness in the subsequent treatment of Mr. Griggens. Indeed, upon the whole, it struck us that among the ladies he seemed rather more popular than before. To recount all the drollery of Mr. Griggens at supper, would fill such a tiny volume as this, to the very bottom of the outside cover. How he drank out of other people's glasses, and ate of other people's bread, how he frightened into screaming convulsions a little boy who was sitting up to supper in a high chair, by sinking below the table and suddenly reappearing with a mask on, how the hostess was really surprised that anybody could find a pleasure in tormenting children, and how the host frowned at the hostess, and felt convinced that Mr. Griggens had done it with the very best intentions, how Mr. Griggens explained, and how everybody's good humour was restored but the child's. To tell these and 100 other things ever so briefly, would occupy more of our room and our readers' patience, than either they or we can conveniently spare. Therefore we change the subject, merely observing that we have offered no description of the funny young gentleman's personal appearance, believing that almost every society has a Griggens of its own, and leaving all readers to supply the deficiency, according to the particular circumstances of their particular case. The theatrical young gentleman. All gentlemen who love the drama, and there are few gentlemen who are not attached to the most intellectual and rational of all our amusements, do not come within this definition. As we have no mean relish for theatrical entertainments ourselves, we are disinterestedly anxious that this should be perfectly understood. The theatrical young gentleman has early and important information on all theatrical topics. Well, says he, abruptly, when you meet him in the street, here's a pretty to-do. Flimkins has thrown up his part in the melodrama at the Surrey, and what's to be done, you inquire with as much gravity as you can counterfeit. Ah, that's the point, replies the theatrical young gentleman, looking very serious. Buzzell declines it, positively declines it. From all I am told, I should say it was decidedly in Buzzell's line, and that he would be very likely to make a great hit in it, but he objects on the ground of Flimkins having been put up in the part first, and says no earthly power shall induce him to take the character. It's a fine part, too excellent business, I'm told. He has to kill 6 people in the course of the piece, and to fight over a bridge in red fire, which is as safe a card, you know, as can be. Don't mention it, but I hear that the last scene, when he is first poisoned, and then stabbed, by Mrs. Flimkins as Vengadora, will be the greatest thing that has been done these many years. With this piece of news, and laying his finger on his lips as a caution for you not to excite the town with it, the theatrical young gentleman hurries away. The theatrical young gentleman, from often frequenting the different theatrical establishments, has pet and familiar names for them all. Thus Covent Garden is the Garden, Drury Lane the Lane, the Victoria the Vic, and the Olympic the Pic. Actresses, too, are always designated by their surnames only, as Taylor, Nisbet, Fawcett, Honey, that talented and ladylike girl Sheriff, that clever little creature Horton, and so on. In the same manner he prefixes Christian names when he mentions actors, as Charlie Young, Jemmy Buckstone, Fred Yates, Paul Bedford. When he is at a loss for a Christian name, the word old applied indiscriminately answers quite as well, as old Charlie Matthews at Vestreaces, old Harley, and old Braham. He has a great knowledge of the private proceedings of actresses, especially of their getting married, and can tell you in a breath half a dozen who have changed their names without avowing it. Whenever an alteration of this kind is made in the playbills, he will remind you that he let you into the secret 6 months ago. The theatrical young gentleman has a great reverence for all that is connected with the stage department of the different theatres. He would, at any time, prefer going a street or two out of his way, to omitting to pass a stage entrance, into which he always looks with a curious and searching eye. If he can only identify a popular actor in the street, he is in a perfect transport of delight, and no sooner meets him, than he hurries back, and walks a few paces in front of him, so that he can turn round from time to time, and have a good stare at his features. He looks upon a theatrical fund dinner as one of the most enchanting festivities ever known, and thinks that to be a member of the Garrick Club, and see so many actors in their plain clothes, must be one of the highest gratifications the world can bestow. The theatrical young gentleman is a constant half-price visitor at one or other of the theatres, and has an infinite relish for all pieces which display the fullest resources of the establishment. He likes to place implicit reliance upon the playbills when he goes to see a show piece, and works himself up to such a pitch of enthusiasm, as not only to believe, if the bills say so, that there are 375 people on the stage at one time in the last scene, but is highly indignant with you, unless you believe it also. He considers that if the stage be opened from the footlights to the back wall, in any new play, the piece is a triumph of dramatic writing, and applauds accordingly. He has a great notion of trapdoors too, and thinks any character going down or coming up a trap, no matter whether he be an angel or a demon, they both do it occasionally, one of the most interesting feats in the whole range of scenic illusion. Besides these acquirements, he has several veracious accounts to communicate of the private manners and customs of different actors, which, during the pauses of a quadrille, he usually communicates to his partner, or imparts to his neighbour at a supper table. Thus he is advised, that Mr. Liston always had a footman in gorgeous livery waiting at the side scene with a brandy bottle and tumbler, to administer half a pint or so of spirit to him every time he came off, without which assistance he must infallibly have fainted. He knows for a fact, that, after an arduous part, Mr. George Bennet is put between two feather beds, to absorb the perspiration, and is credibly informed, that Mr. Baker has, for many years, submitted to a course of lukewarm toast and water, to qualify him to sustain his favourite characters. He looks upon Mr. Fitzball as the principal dramatic genius and poet of the day, but holds that there are great writers extant besides him, in proof whereof he refers you to various dramas and melodramas recently produced, of which he takes in all the 6-penny and 3-penny editions as fast as they appear. The theatrical young gentleman is a great advocate for violence of emotion and redundancy of action. If a father has to curse a child upon the stage, he likes to see it done in the thoroughgoing style, with no mistake about it, to which end it is essential that the child should follow the father on her knees, and be knocked violently over on her face by the old gentleman as he goes into a small cottage, and shuts the door behind him. He likes to see a blessing invoked upon the young lady, when the old gentleman repents, with equal earnestness, and accompanied by the usual conventional forms, which consist of the old gentleman looking anxiously up into the clouds, as if to see whether it rains, and then spreading an imaginary tablecloth in the air over the young lady's head, soft music playing all the while. Upon these, and other points of a similar kind, the theatrical young gentleman is a great critic indeed. He is likewise very acute in judging of natural expressions of the passions, and knows precisely the frown, wink, nod, or leer, which stands for any one of them, or the means by which it may be converted into any other, as jealousy, with a good stamp of the right foot, becomes anger, or wildness, with the hands clasped before the throat, instead of tearing the wig, is passionate love. If you venture to express a doubt of the accuracy of any of these portraitures, the theatrical young gentleman assures you, with a haughty smile, that it always has been done in that way, and he supposes they are not going to change it at this time of day to please you, to which, of course, you meekly reply that you suppose not. There are innumerable disquisitions of this nature, in which the theatrical young gentleman is very profound, especially to ladies whom he is most in the habit of entertaining with them, but as we have no space to recapitulate them at greater length, we must rest content with calling the attention of the young ladies in general to the theatrical young gentleman of their own acquaintance. The poetical young gentleman. Time was, and not very long ago either, when a singular epidemic raged among the young gentlemen, vast numbers of whom, under the influence of the malady, tore off their neckerchiefs, turned down their shirt collars, and exhibited themselves in the open streets with bare throats and dejected countenances, before the eyes of an astonished public. These were poetical young gentlemen. The custom was gradually found to be inconvenient, as involving the necessity of too much clean linen and too large washing bills, and these outward symptoms have consequently passed away, but we are disposed to think, notwithstanding, that the number of poetical young gentlemen is considerably on the increase. We know a poetical young gentleman, a very poetical young gentleman. We do not mean to say that he is troubled with the gift of poesy in any remarkable degree, but his countenance is of a plaintive and melancholy cast, his manner is abstracted and bespeaks affliction of soul, he seldom has his hair cut, and often talks about being an outcast and wanting a kindred spirit, from which, as well as from many general observations in which he is wont to indulge, concerning mysterious impulses, and yearnings of the heart, and the supremacy of intellect gilding all earthly things with the glowing magic of immortal verse, it is clear to all his friends that he has been stricken poetical. The favorite attitude of the poetical young gentleman is lounging on a sofa with his eyes fixed upon the ceiling, or sitting bolt upright in a high-backed chair, staring with very round eyes at the opposite wall. When he is in one of these positions, his mother, who is a worthy, affectionate old soul, will give you a nudge to bespeak your attention without disturbing the abstracted one, and whisper with a shake of the head, that John's imagination is at some extraordinary work or other. You may take her word for it. Hereupon John looks more fiercely intent upon vacancy than before, and suddenly snatching a pencil from his pocket, puts down 3 words, and a cross on the back of a card, sighs deeply, paces once or twice across the room, inflicts a most unmerciful slap upon his head, and walks moodily up to his dormitory. The poetical young gentleman is apt to acquire peculiar notions of things too, which plain ordinary people, unblessed with a poetical obliquity of vision, would suppose to be rather distorted. For instance, when the sickening murder and mangling of a wretched woman was affording delicious food wherewithal to gorge the insatiable curiosity of the public, our friend the poetical young gentleman was in ecstasies not of disgust, but admiration. Heavens, cried the poetical young gentleman, how grand, how great! We ventured deferentially to inquire upon whom these epithets were bestowed, our humble thoughts oscillating between the police officer who found the criminal, and the lock-keeper who found the head. Upon whom, exclaimed the poetical young gentleman in a frenzy of poetry, upon whom should they be bestowed but upon the murderer? And thereupon it came out, in a fine torrent of eloquence, that the murderer was a great spirit, a bold creature full of daring and nerve, a man of dauntless heart and determined courage, and withal a great casuist and able reasoner, as was fully demonstrated in his philosophical colloquies with the great and noble of the land. We held our peace, and meekly signified our indisposition to controvert these opinions, firstly, because we were no match at quotation for the poetical young gentleman, and secondly, because we felt it would be of little use our entering into any disputation, if we were, being perfectly convinced that the respectable and immoral hero in question is not the first and will not be the last hanged gentleman upon whom false sympathy or diseased curiosity will be plentifully expended. This was a stern mystic flight of the poetical young gentleman. In his milder and softer moments he occasionally lays down his neckcloth, and pens stanzas, which sometimes find their way into a lady's magazine, or the poet's corner of some country newspaper, or which, in default of either vent for his genius, adorn the rainbow leaves of a lady's album. These are generally written upon some such occasions as contemplating the Bank of England by midnight, or beholding St. Paul's in a snowstorm, and when these gloomy objects fail to afford him inspiration, he pours forth his soul in a touching address to a violet, or a plaintive lament that he is no longer a child, but has gradually grown up. The poetical young gentleman is fond of quoting passages from his favorite authors, who are all of the gloomy and desponding school. He has a great deal to say too about the world, and is much given to opining, especially if he has taken anything strong to drink, that there is nothing in it worth living for. He gives you to understand, however, that for the sake of society, he means to bear his part in the tiresome play, manfully resisting the gratification of his own strong desire to make a premature exit, and consoles himself with the reflection, that immortality has some chosen nook for himself and the other great spirits whom earth has chafed and wearied. When the poetical young gentleman makes use of adjectives, they are all superlatives. Everything is of the grandest, greatest, noblest, mightiest, loftiest, or the lowest, meanest, obscurest, vilest, and most pitiful. He knows no medium, for enthusiasm is the soul of poetry, and who's so enthusiastic as a poetical young gentleman? "Mr. Milkwash," says a young lady as she unlocks her album to receive the young gentleman's original impromptu contribution, "how very silent you are. I think you must be in love." "Love," cries the poetical young gentleman, starting from his seat by the fire and terrifying the cat who scampers off at full speed. "Love. That burning, consuming passion, that ardor of the soul, that fierce glowing of the heart. Love. The withering, blighting influence of hope misplaced and affection slighted. Love, did you say? Ha! Ha! Ha!" With this, the poetical young gentleman laughs a laugh belonging only to poets and Mr. O. Smith of the Adelphi Theatre, and sits down, pen in hand, to throw off a page or two of verse in the biting, semi-atheistical demoniac style, which, like the poetical young gentleman himself, is full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The throwing off young gentleman. There is a certain kind of impostor, a bragging, vaunting, puffing young gentleman against whom we are desirous to warn that fairer part of the creation, to whom we more peculiarly devote these our labours. And we are particularly induced to lay a special stress upon this division of our subject, by a little dialogue we held some short time ago, with an esteemed young lady of our acquaintance, touching a most gross specimen of this class of men. We had been urging all the absurdities of his conduct and conversation, and dwelling upon the impossibilities he constantly recounted, to which indeed we had not scrupled to prefix a certain hard little word of 1 syllable and 3 letters, when our fair friend, unable to maintain the contest any longer, reluctantly cried, "Well, he certainly has a habit of throwing off, but then what then?" "Throw him off yourself," said we. And so she did, but not at our instance, for other reasons appeared, and it might have been better if she had done so at first. The throwing off young gentleman has so often a father possessed of vast property in some remote district of Ireland, that we look with some suspicion upon all young gentlemen who volunteer this description of themselves. The deceased grandfather of the throwing off young gentleman was a man of immense possessions, and untold wealth. The throwing off young gentleman remembers, as well as if it were only yesterday, the deceased baronet's library, with its long rows of scarce and valuable books in superbly embossed bindings, arranged in cases, reaching from the lofty ceiling to the oaken floor, and the fine antique chairs and tables, and the noble old castle of Ballickil, with its splendid prospect of hill and dale and wood and rich wild scenery, and the fine hunting stables and the spacious courtyards, and everything upon the same magnificent scale, says the throwing off young gentleman, princely, quite princely. Ah! And he sighs as if mourning over the fallen fortunes of his noble house. The throwing off young gentleman is a universal genius, at walking, running, rowing, swimming, and skating. He is unrivaled, at all games of chance or skill, at hunting, shooting, fishing, riding, driving, or amateur theatricals. No one can touch him that is could not, because he gives you carefully to understand, lest there should be any opportunity of testing his skill, that he is quite out of practice just now, and has been for some years. If you mention any beautiful girl of your common acquaintance in his hearing, the throwing off young gentleman starts, smiles, and begs you not to mind him, for it was quite involuntary. People do say indeed that they were once engaged, but no, although she is a very fine girl, he was so situated at that time that he couldn't possibly encourage the but it's of no use talking about it, he adds, interrupting himself. She has got over it now, and I firmly hope and trust is happy. With this benevolent aspiration he nods his head in a mysterious manner, and whistling the first part of some popular air, thinks perhaps it will be better to change the subject. There is another great characteristic of the throwing off young gentleman, which is, that he happens to be acquainted with the most extraordinary variety of people in all parts of the world. Thus in all disputed questions, when the throwing off young gentleman has no argument to bring forward, he invariably happens to be acquainted with some distant person, intimately connected with the subject, whose testimony decides the point against you, to the great, may we say it, to the great admiration of 3 young ladies out of every 4, who consider the throwing off young gentleman a very highly connected young man, and a most charming person. Sometimes the throwing off young gentleman happens to look in upon a little family circle of young ladies who are quietly spending the evening together, and then indeed is he at the very height and summit of his glory, for it is to be observed that he by no means shines to equal advantage in the presence of men as in the society of overcredulous young ladies, which is his proper element. It is delightful to hear the number of pretty things the throwing off young gentleman gives utterance to, during tea, and still more so to observe the ease with which, from long practice and study, he delicately blends one compliment to a lady with 2 for himself. Did you ever see a more lovely blue than this flower, Mr. Caviton? Asks a young lady who, truth to tell, is rather smitten with the throwing off young gentleman. Never, he replies, bending over the object of admiration, never but in your eyes. Oh, Mr. Caviton, cries the young lady, blushing of course. Indeed I speak the truth, replies the throwing off young gentleman, I never saw any approach to them. I used to think my cousin's blue eyes lovely, but they grow dim and colourless beside yours. Oh! A beautiful cousin, Mr. Caviton, replies the young lady, with that perfect artlessness which is the distinguishing characteristic of all young ladies, an affair, of course. No, indeed you wrong me, rejoins the throwing off young gentleman with great energy. I fervently hope that her attachment towards me may be nothing but the natural result of our close intimacy in childhood, and that in change of scene and among new faces she may soon overcome it. I love her. Think not so meanly of me, Miss Lowfield, I beseech, as to suppose that title, lands, riches, and beauty, can influence my choice. The heart, Miss Lowfield. Here the throwing off young gentleman sinks his voice to a still lower whisper, and the young lady duly proclaims to all the other young ladies when they go upstairs, to put their bonnets on, that Mr. Caviton's relations are all immensely rich, and that he is hopelessly beloved by title, lands, riches, and beauty. We have seen a throwing off young gentleman who, to our certain knowledge, was innocent of a note of music, and scarcely able to recognize a tune by ear, volunteer a Spanish air upon the guitar when he had previously satisfied himself that there was not such an instrument within a mile of the house. We have heard another throwing off young gentleman, after striking a note or 2 upon the piano, and accompanying it correctly, by dint of laborious practice, with his voice, assure a circle of wondering listeners that so acute was his ear that he was wholly unable to sing out of tune, let him try as he would. We have lived to witness the unmasking of another throwing off young gentleman, who went out a-visiting in a military cap with a gold band and tassel, and who, after passing successfully for a captain and being lauded to the skies for his red whiskers, his bravery, his soldierly bearing and his pride, turned out to be the dishonest son of an honest linen draper in a small country town, and whom, if it were not for this fortunate exposure, we should not yet despair of encountering as the fortunate husband of some rich heiress. Ladies, the throwing off young gentlemen are often swindlers, and always fools. So pray you avoid them. The young lady's young gentleman. This young gentleman has several titles. Some young ladies consider him a nice young man, others a fine young man, others quite a lady's man, others a handsome man, others a remarkably good-looking young man. With some young ladies he is a perfect angel, and with others quite a love. He is likewise a charming creature, a duck and a deer. The young lady's young gentleman has usually a fresh color and very white teeth, which latter articles, of course, he displays on every possible opportunity. He has brown or black hair, and whiskers of the same, if possible, but a slight tinge of red, or the hue which is vulgarly known as sandy, is not considered an objection. If his head and face be large, his nose prominent, and his figure square, he is an uncommonly fine young man, and worshipped accordingly. Should his whiskers meet beneath his chin, so much the better, though this is not absolutely insisted on, but he must wear an under-waistcoat, and smile constantly. There was a great party got up by some party-loving friends of ours last summer, to go and dine in Epping Forest. As we hold that such wild expeditions should never be indulged in, save by people of the smallest means, who have no dinner at home, we should indubitably have excused ourselves from attending, if we had not recollected that the projectors of the excursion were always accompanied on such occasions by a choice sample of the young lady's young gentleman, whom we were very anxious to have an opportunity of meeting. This determined us, and we went. We were to make for Chigwell in 4 glass coaches, each with a trifling company of 6 or 8 inside, and a little boy belonging to the projectors on the box, and to start from the residence of the projectors, Woburn Place, Russell Square, at 10:30 precisely. We arrived at the place of rendezvous at the appointed time, and found the glass coaches and the little boys quite ready, and divers young ladies and young gentlemen looking anxiously over the breakfast parlour blinds, who appeared by no means so much gratified by our approach as we might have expected, but evidently wished we had been somebody else. Observing that our arrival in lieu of the unknown occasioned some disappointment, we ventured to inquire who was yet to come, when we found from the hasty reply of a dozen voices, that it was no other than the young lady's young gentleman. "I cannot imagine," said the mamma, "what has become of Mr. Balam, always so punctual, always so pleasant and agreeable. I am sure I cannot think." As these last words were uttered in that measured, emphatic manner which painfully announces that the speaker has not quite made up his or her mind what to say, but is determined to talk on nevertheless, the eldest daughter took up the subject, and hoped no accident had happened to Mr. Balam, upon which there was a general chorus of "Dear Mr. Balam," and one young lady, more adventurous than the rest, proposed that an express should be straightway sent to dear Mr. Balam's lodgings. This, however, the papa resolutely opposed, observing, in what a short young lady behind us termed quite a bearish way, that if Mr. Balam didn't choose to come, he might stop at home. At this all the daughters raised a murmur of "Oh pa," except one sprightly little girl of 8 or 10 years old, who, taking advantage of a pause in the discourse, remarked, that perhaps Mr. Balam might have been married that morning, for which impertinent suggestion she was summarily ejected from the room by her eldest sister. We were all in a state of great mortification and uneasiness, when one of the little boys, running into the room as airily as little boys usually run who have an unlimited allowance of animal food in the holidays, and keep their hands constantly forced down to the bottoms of very deep trouser pockets when they take exercise, joyfully announced that Mr. Balam was at that moment coming up the street in a hackney cab, and the intelligence was confirmed beyond all doubt a minute afterwards by the entry of Mr. Balam himself, who was received with repeated cries of "Where have you been, you naughty creature?" whereunto the naughty creature replied, that he had been in bed, in consequence of a late party the night before, and had only just risen. The acknowledgment awakened a variety of agonizing fears that he had taken no breakfast, which appearing after a slight cross-examination to be the real state of the case, breakfast for one was immediately ordered, notwithstanding Mr. Balam's repeated protestations that he couldn't think of it. He did think of it though, and thought better of it too, for he made a remarkably good meal when it came, and was assiduously served by a select knot of young ladies. It was quite delightful to see how he ate and drank, while one pair of fair hands poured out his coffee, and another put in the sugar, and another the milk, the rest of the company ever and anon casting angry glances at their watches, and the glass coaches and the little boys looking on in an agony of apprehension lest it should begin to rain before we set out. It might have rained all day, after we were once too far to turn back again, and welcome, for aught they cared. However, the cavalcade moved at length, every coachman being accommodated with a hamper between his legs something larger than a wheelbarrow, and the company being packed as closely as they possibly could in the carriages, according, as one married lady observed, to the immemorial custom, which was half the diversion of gypsy parties. Thinking it very likely it might be, we have never been able to discover the other half, we submitted to be stowed away with a cheerful aspect, and were fortunate enough to occupy one corner of a coach in which were one old lady, 4 young ladies, and the renowned Mr. Balam the young lady's young gentleman. We were no sooner fairly off, than the young lady's young gentleman hummed a fragment of an air, which induced a young lady to inquire whether he had danced to that the night before. "By heaven, then, I did," replied the young gentleman, "and with a lovely heiress, a superb creature, with £20,000. "You seem rather struck," observed another young lady. "Gad, she was a sweet creature," returned the young gentleman, arranging his hair. Of course she was struck too, inquired the first young lady. How can you ask, love, interposed the second, could she fail to be? Well, honestly I think she was, observed the young gentleman. At this point of the dialogue, the young lady who had spoken first, and who sat on the young gentleman's right, struck him a severe blow on the arm with a rosebud, and said he was a vain man, whereupon the young gentleman insisted on having the rosebud, and the young lady appealing for help to the other young ladies. A charming struggle ensued, terminating in the victory of the young gentleman, and the capture of the rosebud. This little skirmish over, the married lady, who was the mother of the rosebud, smiled sweetly upon the young gentleman, and accused him of being a flirt, the young gentleman pleading not guilty. A most interesting discussion took place upon the important point whether the young gentleman was a flirt or not, which being an agreeable conversation of a light kind, lasted a considerable time. At length, a short silence occurring, the young ladies on either side of the young gentleman fell suddenly fast asleep, and the young gentleman, winking upon us to preserve silence, won a pair of gloves from each, thereby causing them to wake with equal suddenness and to scream very loud. The lively conversation to which this pleasantry gave rise, lasted for the remainder of the ride, and would have eked out a much longer one. We dined rather more comfortably than people usually do under such circumstances, nothing having been left behind but the corkscrew and the bread. The married gentlemen were unusually thirsty, which they attributed to the heat of the weather, the little boys ate to inconvenience, mammas were very jovial, and their daughters very fascinating, and the attendants being well-behaved men, got exceedingly drunk at a respectful distance. We had our eye on Mr. Balaam at dinner time, and perceived that he flourished wonderfully, being still surrounded by a little group of young ladies, who listened to him as an oracle, while he ate from their plates and drank from their glasses in a manner truly captivating from its excessive playfulness. His conversation, too, was exceedingly brilliant. In fact, one elderly lady assured us, that in the course of a little lively badinage on the subject of ladies' dresses, he had evinced as much knowledge as if he had been born and bred a milliner. As such of the fat people who did not happen to fall asleep after dinner entered upon a most vigorous game at ball, we slipped away alone into a thicker part of the wood, hoping to fall in with Mr. Balaam, the greater part of the young people having dropped off in twos and threes and the young ladies young gentlemen among them. Nor were we disappointed, for we had not walked far, when, peeping through the trees, we discovered him before us, and truly it was a pleasant thing to contemplate his greatness. The young lady's young gentleman was seated upon the ground, at the feet of a few young ladies who were reclining on a bank. He was so profusely decked with scarfs, ribbons, flowers, and other pretty spoils, that he looked like a lamb, or perhaps a calf would be a better simile, adorned for the sacrifice. One young lady supported a parasol over his interesting head, another held his hat, and a third his neckcloth, which in romantic fashion he had thrown off. The young gentleman himself, with his hand upon his breast, and his face moulded into an expression of the most honeyed sweetness, was warbling forth some choice specimens of vocal music in praise of female loveliness, in a style so exquisitely perfect, that we burst into an involuntary shout of laughter, and made a hasty retreat. What charming fellows these young ladies young gentlemen are! Ducks, dears, loves, angels, are all terms inadequate to express their merit. They are such amazingly, uncommonly, wonderfully, nice men. Conclusion. As we have placed before the young ladies so many specimens of young gentlemen, and have also in the dedication of this volume given them to understand how much we reverence and admire their numerous virtues and perfections, as we have given them such strong reasons to treat us with confidence, and to banish, in our case, all that reserve and distrust of the male sex which, as a point of general behavior, they cannot do better than preserve and maintain, we say, as we have done all this, we feel that now, when we have arrived at the close of our task, they may naturally press upon us the inquiry, what particular description of young gentlemen we can conscientiously recommend. Here we are at a loss. We look over our list, and can neither recommend the bashful young gentleman, nor the out-and-out young gentleman, nor the very friendly young gentleman, nor the military young gentleman, nor the political young gentleman, nor the domestic young gentleman, nor the censorious young gentleman, nor the funny young gentleman, nor the theatrical young gentleman, nor the poetical young gentleman, nor the throwing off young gentleman, nor the young ladies young gentleman. As there are some good points about many of them, which still are not sufficiently numerous to render any one among them eligible, as a whole, our respectful advice to the young ladies is, to seek for a young gentleman who unites in himself the best qualities of all, and the worst weaknesses of none, and to lead him forthwith to the hymeneal altar, whether he will or no. And to the young lady who secures him, we beg to tender one short fragment of matrimonial advice, selected from many sound passages of a similar tendency, to be found in a letter written by Dean Swift to a young lady on her marriage. The grand affair of your life will be to gain and preserve the esteem of your husband. Neither good nature nor virtue will suffer him to esteem you against his judgment, and although he is not capable of using you ill, yet you will in time grow a thing indifferent and perhaps contemptible, unless you can supply the loss of youth and beauty with more durable qualities. You have but a very few years to be young and handsome in the eyes of the world, and as few months to be so in the eyes of a husband who is not a fool. for I hope you do not still dream of charms and raptures, which marriage ever did, and ever will, put a sudden end to. From the anxiety we express for the proper behaviour of the fortunate lady after marriage, it may possibly be inferred that the young gentleman to whom we have so delicately alluded, is no other than ourself. Without in any way committing ourself upon this point, we have merely to observe, that we are ready to receive sealed offers containing a full specification of age, temper, appearance, and condition, but we beg it to be distinctly understood that we do not pledge ourselves to accept the highest bidder. These offers may be forwarded to the publishers, Messrs. Chapman and Hall, London, to whom all pieces of plate and other testimonials of approbation from the young ladies generally, are respectfully requested to be addressed.